Welcome to this afternoon's event on the economics of biodiversity. My name is Maria de Mergis, and I am the Deputy Director at Bruegel. And together with Bruegel's Director, Guntram Wolf, we are delighted and very honored to have our guest with us today. We are very happy to have Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Timmermans, back at one of Bruegel's events. And together with him, we also have Professor Dasgupta, who has chaired an independent report written for the UK Treasury on exactly the topic of the economics of biodiversity. This is a topic that we are going to hear a lot more as we advance on our ambitions on climate change and energy transitions. Perhaps I could start the conversation by turning to you, Mr. Timmermans, and actually if you could give us your initial thoughts on the issue, particularly from the point of view of the EU and how the EU, countries in the EU and EU collectively, we are addressing biodiversity, the biodiversity crisis, dare I say, and what actions are taken to put the EU's economy onto what we call a sustainable path.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much for the possibility to have a discussion also with Professor Dasgupta. He's produced a report which I think is of extreme importance for the work we all do. And I believe it helps focus on an issue that has been, well, one could say neglected over a longer period of time. I have started to define production factors differently a couple of years ago. Traditionally, one would say it's labor and capital that determine the production factors in our economy. In the modern economy, we should add to data. Data has become a production factor of considerable importance, and many people don't see it that way. They hand out data for free, and others are making a lot of money with that. And this is not coming back to the general public or to the common good. And the other one is Gaia. I call it Gaia because these are the planetary limits within which we need to learn to live. And we're not living within planetary limits now. We're destroying our nature, we're destroying our air, and then we say we want to save the planet, but this has nothing to do with the planet. It's saving humanity what we need to do. The planet can exist perfectly well without us. It has existed for a long time without us and could go on existing without us. If we misbehave too much, we'll make sure it will exist without us. So what we need to do is to learn to live within planetary boundaries. And the Dasgupta report points to one specific element that needs much more attention than in the past. Now, fortunately, everybody's very much aware of the dangers of the climate crisis. And this has now become one of the issues that has captured the imagination of large parts of the world's population. And thanks also to younger generations, we are now compelled to do something about it. It used to be science asking for this. Now it's become a broader societal issue. And the pandemic has taught us to respect science a bit more than we used to. And we should use that opportunity to bring science into this debate as well. Now, so as I said, the climate crisis is very much on people's minds, and people want us to do something about it, even though there is this pandemic. What I would like to see is the same sense of urgency as far as the threat of ecocide is concerned. If we don't act, and if we don't act urgently, we will lose 1 million species. And some people will say, well, less insects, so what? The issue is that the delicate balance, and this again is something the Dasgupta report describes so well, the delicate balance within which our existence is possible needs to be restored because it's lost. And restoring it means, for instance, preventing the disappearance of 1 million species. It means we have to set aside parts of our natural environment so it can recover. That's why in our action plan, we will announce, we want to work towards setting aside 30% of our landmass and 30% of the marine area so that it can recover, so that the natural environment can recover there and then provide more protection for humanity. I think increasingly science tells us very clearly that the pandemic is also a result of us having close the gap between humans and viruses. You know, in normal circumstances, in a healthy natural environment, much of our ecosystem would have taken care of neutralizing viruses before they reach humans. And since we have destroyed much of the correction power of our natural environment, we have made ourselves much, much more vulnerable. Now, this is no longer about correcting here and there. This is about fundamental change in the way we live, in the way we produce, in the way we relate with our natural environment, in the way we relate internationally with our partners. So we need to try and make real strides forward in the preparation of the Kunming COP15 on biodiversity. We have to convince our international partners to put biodiversity protection higher on the agenda. We have to convince everyone that in certain marine areas and land masses, we need to create protected areas, some with huge urgency. Think about the Antarctic, where we would need international agreement to make sure that that area remains or is better protected than it is today. We need to look at issues such as fisheries, and we need to move quickly towards an economy that does not need a natural resource extraction to the level that we need now. So decarbonizing our economy, also for other reasons, extremely important, and making a circular economy. And the economic policies we are developing in the European Union should help the economy transit to a circular economy so that we limit the level of resource extraction, that we increase the levels of repair, reuse, recycling of products, and that we can set this on a course that would create jobs and profits with that still within planetary boundaries. And it's becoming very urgent because we are very close to a number of tipping points. Once we've gone through those tipping points, there is absolutely no way humanity can be master of its own destiny anymore. We will just have to suffer the consequences of those tipping points. To summarize just a couple of ideas. First of all, let's recognize the fact that we need to change everything we do to be able to live within planetary boundaries, because we don't have 3 planets, we only have 1. And if we admit that the rest of humanity has full right to live in the same conditions as we do in the Western world, then we need to create the space within our natural boundaries to make that happen. Secondly, we need to create a sense of urgency that we need to reestablish a natural relationship between us and our environment to make sure we have no biodiversity loss or limit the biodiversity loss, and that we recreate a healthy natural environment. I think this is essential if you want to feed the planet. Our agricultural policies today are a direct threat to biodiversity. We need to be able to produce agriculture with a lot less pesticides, a lot less fertilizers, bar as much as possible the use of medication in animal husbandry. Farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy. Europe is trying to come up with comprehensive plans to take it in that direction. I am happy to see that increasingly around the world we get support for this, and we see plans evolving in the United States, in China to some extent, in India, and I think this could help the world move in the right direction. But once again, I want to thank Professor Dasgupta for something that is of immense importance to create the sense of urgency that we urgently need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Timmermans. And let me now turn to you, Professor Dasgupta, and thank you again for being here with us. We have heard already the Vice President throwing a few keywords and a few important messages about the sense of urgency, but also terms like Gaia and the master of the planet were terms used. And of course, the fact that humanity is highly integrated into our natural system has been clear for any ecologist and natural scientist, but economists have tended to see the systems quite separate. And the interesting thing, I think, also about this report is that you are, of course, a professor of economics, and therefore I would like to ask you our first question. how are really our economies integrated and connected to nature?
Well, there's a very long answer, like 600 pages of the review. And there is a short answer, which is to say anything other than the fact that we are embedded, we humans are embedded in nature, is to not understand who we are. We are part of nature. Every bit of us is part of nature. So the human economy, human organizations are embedded in it. Now, I think the reason this is not perceived in economic models, and you're quite right that it isn't, we can't escape from that criticism. And the review is essentially aimed at dispelling that notion and then repairing that error. Okay, it's not a question of just grafting some natural capital inside the normal model, but to actually embrace it so that it's like creating a home within which we live, and we work with it, and we can't allow that structure and the things that go inside it to be destroyed. So it is essential. I think the reason it was neglected is that when the global pressure on the biosphere was less than the biosphere's capacity to regenerate itself, it looked as though it could be freely used. And for a variety of reasons that the review makes quite clear, and there are three reasons. One is nature is mobile, moves, unlike desks, buildings, so it's hard to have property rights on them. The other two are much more subtle. Nature is silent mostly. Nature's processes are silent, and and the processes are also invisible. Many of them underneath your feet. What happens in the soil, you don't observe or hear. So it is very easy to overlook it, except through its consequences. So long as the global demand did not exceed its biosphere's regenerative capacity, and the fact that so much of nature is hard to make into private property, even national property, like the atmosphere, open seas, it was regarded as free good. People behaved as though it was free good for the reason that it was free good. Nobody was charging for it. Hence, it was taken as though it's limitless at the individual level. Okay, of course, that exasperated the problem.
It sounds very much like a tragedy of the commons that you're describing, Professor Dasgupta.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly. It is a tragedy of the commons writ large. And yeah.
And the question is what to do about it, and you know, what should our policy, our financial and economic, if I may, it's not just our policy though. It's beyond that. It's also our economic thinking. It's interesting that Mr. Timmermans talked about the new production function, where we don't just add capital and labor, but we need to add new things. We need to add data, he said, which I thought was very interesting, a very interesting thing. Natural capital. I mean, it's interesting to see in the past 20 years we have a replacement of capital, of what we call physical capital, with something called intangible capital. Yet now we have something else, natural capital. How do we measure that so that we can put it in the production function and then give it the proper price that is going to remove the tragedy of the commons element?
The conceptual unity of the review is it starts with ecosystems as the base. And ecosystems can range from small, my mouth is an ecosystem, it's as small as that, to the atmosphere is an ecosystem, the rainforests are ecosystems, and so forth. Now, it is not very difficult to conceive of ecosystems as capital assets. And of course, if it's privatized, then the person who owns it can charge for its use. So payments for ecosystem service is a practice that has been tried out in many countries and is increasingly popular, is designed to do that. Somehow or the other to get an incentive structure going whereby the goods and services Mother Nature produces get priced at the level of use, okay? So that's the general idea. When I say price, I don't mean vulgar monetary. It means picking up something like the social value of those goods. Okay. Now, what the vice president said was exactly right, and the review has a formal type model of growth and development in which nature appears as an asset in two ways. One is the way we draw on nature, resources we extract and feed into the production structure of factories and so forth. That's there, and that's more conventional. But what is not conventional, in the sense that it's not orthodox, which I hope it becomes orthodox, is that the whole idea of the productivity of the economy itself depends on the size of the characteristics and the quality of the biosphere. So that if that shrinks, then there's no way of substituting your way out of the problem. Okay, the model has that, because it's very intuitively clear how it should be. It's like your home. If your life is going to be miserable if your roof collapses and your floor gives over, okay, you can't then substitute your way out of it, since you can't move out of the home. Biosphere is finite and you're embedded in it. So that part is easy. It's been done. The review has it. We can then start trying to estimate. When the model is estimated, it can be used for the purposes of devising accounting prices, shadow prices, as it were, depending on the needs. Because what you do is to tease out the productivity of the components of the biosphere in the production structure. So for example, if there is a wetland, the value of the wetland, the productivity of that wetland will be perceived through its impact on the quality of life. Okay, we'll be taking perhaps fiber from it, it cleans water, and each of these objects, these services, can be priced to the average household, as it were. Now, so the idea is for the, as the vice president was saying, the idea will be to have policies which enable, and institutions which enable the private incentives to align themselves with the common good. So long as it's all free, of course, there is no alignment whatsoever with the common good. Common good means not just our good, but our descendants' goods as well. So I'm looking at it intertemporally, okay, which is the source of the problem. So that part is easy. The hard bit is to devise the institutions, okay? Because the easier bit, relatively speaking, is to understand the productivity of the various ecosystems on Earth. That's the easier part. Downside, hard to measure maybe, but there are ecologists and earth scientists to help, okay? And there's plenty of work in that direction. The hard bit is to think of the institutions, because so many of these services are public goods. Some are global public goods. So we run into the problem of the commons, as you previously mentioned. Now, I'll come back to this point in a minute, but when the vice president talked of the goal of keeping 30% of land and the oceans protected, think of that idea of protection as quantity constraints. It says you cannot enter that sphere, all right? It's not as though you pay a tax and you can go in. You're having rigid quantity constraints, and that's exactly right. I mean, I applaud that, because we mustn't use the price mechanism there. We must guard it for a variety of reasons, which the review makes absolutely clear, and I will not repeat that here. But the worry would be, what happens to the rest of the 70%? To think that if we protect these 30% and let life go on as before, and the rest of the 70% would be a disaster. For the reason that the biosphere is an integrated regenerative entity. The problems diffuse across, there's no boundaries. You can't build a wall. There's no way, okay? So we have to think about the other 70%. And it's in that light, let me air a couple of thoughts, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers. Natural capital, and I'm using the word natural capital, but of course it's not just one object. Just like physical capital, there are roads, machines of all kinds and so forth, so heterogeneity. So I'm going to use natural capital, even though there are zillions and zillions of types of units which are making up, going together to make the biosphere. Natural capital is an asset. So just like the other assets, the economics of biodiversity is really an asset management problem. Bearing in mind that when I talk about the value of an asset, I do not necessarily mean, I certainly don't mean the market price, because many of them are zero at the moment. I mean social price, which includes, by the way, lest anybody misunderstand, it includes non-use value as well. Okay, intrinsic value of nature is something we economists understand, or at least recognize, and beyond that, there are sacred objects out there. Some aspects of the biosphere are sacred to cultures. And when I say value, I mean that included. And if it's sacred, of course, you'll then bring in, again, the quantity constraint. You don't touch it, just as you don't touch sacred groves. In many countries, there are rules and regulations which prevent people from entry. So I want to lay that aside for the moment, okay? Because I don't want to use the word price to reflect the idea that we are really, narrow-minded people with no sensibilities. Okay. So by price, I mean social price. So if it's an asset management problem, what does economics tell us? It tells us to distinguish at the first round between the private investor, the private individual, and let me call somebody as a public investor. And my notion of public is now somebody like yourselves, unlike the vice president, because he's representing a collective body. He's not thinking about biodiversity as the private individual. He's trying to amalgamate something like a collective view of the common good. I know it's all very difficult and everything, but the distinction is extremely important and is real. It's not something I'm imagining. Okay, take the private chap. For the small person, and a company, maybe even a company is small relative to the world economy, will take the prices, the environment, the socio-ecological environment as given, because he can't really change it much. Just as a small household cannot change prices in the supermarket, they're given, he or she, the householder, has to operate within the constraints that the socio-economic world has given him. Versus the vice president, who is representing the European Union, policies like, say, 30% protected zone really shapes the environment in which the private person is acting. However, both of them are concerned with both the private investor and the public investor, I'm going to call it now, the public investor or the citizen investor. That's the right way of putting it. I'm going to call the vice president a citizen as opposed to okay. As a citizen, he thinks of the rate of return, the return on the assets in terms of shadow prices or accounting prices, social values, whereas the private investor sees it in terms of, because he has shareholders to meet, children to educate, so she will take the prices that they're given. Otherwise, the rule is the same. Each wants to maximize wealth because it's an asset management problem. The only thing is, what appears to be wealth for the vice president is different from what appears to wealth, even for him as an individual, as a head of his own household. And this demarcation is something we all experience in our daily lives. In the morning, sometimes when we read the newspaper, we react as a citizen. And when we go to our jobs, we have to do the best we can, increase the possibility of a promotion and so forth, which is all absolutely normal. So this asset management problem is the common ground. The rest is, how does the public side of how the public citizen, the collective decision, influence the prices that the private investor faces in order to be able to do the right thing? The problem is, the interesting question really is for the private investor. What should firms do in the face of this great uncertainty as to what will happen in the future? If there were a sufficient number of markets, future markets, forward markets, contingent market, risk markets, then of course we wouldn't be discussing this problem here, because we would say, well, those market signals are actually signaling future scarcities due to biodiversity loss. The problem is those markets don't exist. So the one way, what the review does, is to highlight the fact that it's in the interest of the private companies to have the public side of life, governments, international agreements, to constrain shape the choices that the public investor has to make the risk less. And one way we do it, and I'll end there, is the following. And there's a great deal in the review on this, which is disclosure. A company manufactures something, let us say in England, but of course the origins of it are primary products, let us say in sub-Saharan Africa. All right, and it's imported, and the whole chain of events takes place along the supply chain until the product is sold in a supermarket. Now, we all in the West now are so health conscious that we insist that the food we buy has labels telling us what food content, nutrient content is, how much fat, sugar, salt, and so forth. Why do we do that? We do that because we as consumers want to know the product we are buying. And just looking at it is not telling us. So we insist that we want to know the composition of the product, and it's disclosed. And it's disclosed for two reasons. One is it could be that the law requires it, or even if the law doesn't require it, a firm which doesn't do it may think that, oh, well, I won't be able to build up my reputation in case somebody else does it. And then the customers will flock to that other product and I'll lose out. So either way, the threat of the citizens is an extremely powerful one here. Now this has worked very well with regard to health. What the review does is to argue that that same impetus should come over our treatment of the natural world. That is to say, firms ought to now, if we care about biodiversity, and it so happens that so much of biodiversity is in the poorer parts of the world because they're in the tropics, okay? You'll have data on that in the review. So the idea here is that firms ought to be asked to disclose literally a whole package of information regarding their entire supply chain, including what they pay for it, to whom, and so forth, okay? Now, of course, they are not going to be all in the label, but today that's not a problem because we have the internet. These information can be there for us to read. Now, the advantage of that is that if we insist on doing that, they would through the pure private incentive of companies to move to a situation where waste doesn't take place, where the idea of unfair bargaining at the source, low payments to wages and so forth, they are reduced. So it's a way of saying that disclosure is a way of substituting for the imperfection of markets, lack of markets. So let me sum up. The review creates at the macro level a model of the world in which natural capital appears as an essential factor of production, and not just a factor, it's the overall entity within which the human economy and our lives depend and exist. And then it provides ways of suggesting to different types of decision makers how to proceed from that, recognizing that we are looking at an asset management problem. It does it through the household, individual household, through communities. And one of the things I'm particularly pleased about is that we spent quite a bit of time in discussing the way small communities in Africa, South Latin America, and Asia have coped with their local common resources, their water holes, woodlands, and so forth, okay, wetlands and everything. But these are local, they are not global commodities. The norms of behavior that poorer societies have created, isolated communities have created to preserve their local resource base are really remarkable. It's a remarkable story of enormous ingenuity. We have lost that somewhat in the West, obviously, for very good reason, because we are very mobile, we are advanced and everything, and we have the law. But we do need to bring these things together into a mesh, and the review does that. And so through the community to civil society, the role of the civil society in ensuring these public goods are managed, up to the state, and then finally, of course, to the international order. And just one remark, one of the highlights of one of the things that I'm particularly anxious to spread is the idea that just as at the end of the Second World War, new international institutions were created, the World Bank, IMF, to solve some major public goods problems, supply of public goods, because they are concerned with supplying public goods. We now need transnational institutions to be built to protect the biosphere, the open oceans, open seas, which are free open access, tragedy of the commons, as well as the rainforests, which are public goods, but they happen to be within national jurisdiction. So we can't do anything about it. The outsiders can't do anything about it. So they may have to compensate. Moreover, the open seas are a terrific potential source. The 70% that's left, by the way, the 30% is already protected. But the 70% we ought to be charged for transporting ourselves and goods across them, because it's a resource out there and we are using it for free and therefore damaging it, and fishing as well. So these are the issues that are discussed in the review. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Dasgupta, and you did a marvelous job, really pulling a 600-page report together in a very short intervention. And I do want to give the vice president a chance to react to a few points. And I really want to push you, Mr. Timmermans, I think really on the collective action issue and the question, because in a sense, as Professor Dasgupta eloquently pointed out, I mean, you are of course a citizen, but you are also representing an institution that runs policies that should somehow represent the collective interest, but where perhaps the aggregation of these collective interests still is not in line with what the defenders of natural biodiversity, and basically those that, as Professor Dasgupta pointed out, those that want to have a social price for biodiversity would like to see. And in particular, I'm thinking of issues such as the common agricultural policy, where a lot of criticism is being voiced that it does not sufficiently protect biodiversity. So in a sense, the 70%, not the 30%, but the 70% that we use currently is not sufficiently protected. And so if you could give us a bit of a thinking, if you're thinking how we can ensure that your institution, but also other, let's say, multinational, global, international institutions really manage to get a social price on this biodiversity, which is different to the private price being very low, but the social price, so that we factor in the cost of depleting biodiversity in our decisions. So how do we get this institutionally right? How does the European Commission get it institutionally right? But how do we also think about international organizations getting it right?
Well, I think we could start by looking at the pandemic. The pandemic has created a sense of urgency that sort of questions all sorts of assumptions that were not allowed to be questioned. If the crisis is severe enough, then humanity can be mobilized relatively quickly. That's what the pandemic has shown. We are now coming up with vaccines. Everybody's unhappy, not fast enough. But if you look at the usual, habitual production phase of a vaccine, which would be 3 to 4 years, and you can see that you can mobilize funds and attitudes to change that so rapidly, that gives me hope that once we have enough sense of urgency, which sadly is lacking as far as the biodiversity crisis and the threat of ecocide is concerned, the mobilization of humanity can happen quite quickly. The thing is that since we're now in what I would call a perfect storm, we're a cluster of challenges. We have the pandemic, which is of course the one everybody's thinking about first and foremost, We have the climate crisis, we have the biodiversity crisis, we have an industrial revolution that is extremely disruptive at the same time. And we have global population shifts that have a huge influence also on our natural environment. So everything's coming together. And the big question is, are we able to create enough international mobilization to address the issue? And I think one of the brief remarks Professor Dasgupta made, which I want to refer to, is this. I think the thing that is causing us most trouble is that we are prisoners of the here and now. We have created a society where it is very difficult to say to people, we're going to plant a tree, but you're never going to sit in the shadow of that tree. But you still need to invest in planting it. But your kids will, your grandkids will. And sadly, we're in a society in the Western world where we're saying, well, I want that tree tomorrow. And if I can't get that tree tomorrow, I won't plant it. So the extemporal factor needs to be introduced in our political discourse much more than we have done in the last years. It's not about, we have to convince, if we want to get this right, we have to convince our population that to set things right in the future, we might have to take a couple of steps back today. And I think it will take an incredible amount of political capital and of the collective action of politicians, people, scientists, activists, etc., to get humanity in that place. I think it is possible. I think the sense of urgency could increase, but we need that sentiment in society to get us moving. Now, on the interaction between the private and the public, let me give you one example where this has worked well. I hope you can agree with me. That is putting a price on carbon. The emissions trading system is something the private sector understands, because producing carbon means that I have a cost factor. Reducing the production of carbon where I have rights to produce carbon gives me an asset that I can market. And it stimulates me to reduce the production of CO2 with as effect that I do better. And so I modernize, and I have a price on this, a positive price on this activity. But it is something that is publicly organized. ETS, the rules are set publicly. And the fact that the Commission has announced that we will potentially enlarge the scope of the ETS, we will make the rules stricter, we will reduce the amounts of free allowances, already has a market effect. The price of CO2 in the market is going up. It's at 40 euros now. It was at 14 euros less than a year ago. So I just wanted to give you this example. If we can create the same sort of mechanisms linked to our natural environment and biodiversity, you can also translate the issue of the common good into a particular private or more precise interest of an individual company. And I think that's where the nexus is of positive change, that you can relate the need to protect the common good with the need to also foster individual interest of companies and citizens.
Professor, did you want to react or
Yes, well, very briefly, I think the Vice President was talking exactly very much in line with what I was trying to bring together, the coincidence, alignment of private incentives with the common good, that's for sure. The problem, there are ways of thinking about extending it to biodiversity, but there are problems. I'll first point out the similarity and then show why we need greater tools. We could, in principle, think in terms of a market for biomass. That's a counterpart of a carbon market for carbon. And biomass is carbon, actually. It's a weight of carbon in weight. The problem, the reason it's very limiting idea, and I would not pursue it too long, and we didn't in the review, is that biomass in my garden here on my left is very different animal from biomass in an entity, not an animal, but an entity in say, Brazilian rainforest, because of this interacting heterogeneous nature of the biosphere. If it were a completely homogeneous pile, it wouldn't matter where the biomass was, but it's not. It's extremely heterogeneous, and the heterogeneity is extremely important for the entire fabric of the Earth system. So there's not belittling it. That's a fact and has to be made. The problem is, if we have a market for biomass, just suppose we could simulate it the way the Vice President Timmerman was mentioning. You could easily have smart people lifting biomass from some of the most sensitive parts of the world and planting it and then the transaction should be one where you actually buy the right to destroy it here and then plant it somewhere else, which is completely useless. And it'll still be biomass, but it will not have anything like the flavor of the productivity that biomass had there. So that's a real problem. The economics of climate change, in contrast, is really intellectually quite trivial, politically explosive, but intellectually trivial. This one is really intellectually difficult, so I really sometimes shudder. We really have to ask ourselves what world we are leaving behind for our children when we look at them, and if at my age I have grandchildren, looking at their grandchildren, because that's the only thing that will motivate us into the kind of mental framework that the Vice President was urging us to adopt.
I mean, since the Vice President will have to leave very soon, I do want to ask him one question, which comes also from the audience by a person called Catherine, and she's asking, in light of the review, should we rethink or reinvent globalization? And I think if I can add to that question, I mean, what I think the report also shows is mass biodiversity is in the global south. So should we rethink our trade agreements with Brazil, with other countries, and should we impose, in a sense, conditionality in these trade agreements so as to preserve biodiversity? What is your view on this?
Well, I think we're in the process of doing that. We're in the process of reviewing our trade policy. We're also in discussion with the new American administration to see whether we can reform the World Trade Organization to address issues such as global public goods. I would dispute the assumption that if a global public good is located in one nation, that nation has full right to dispose of it the way it wants. The health of the Amazon or of the rainforest in Central Africa or in Southeast Asia, the health of those forests is directly linked with our survival. So we have a vested interest in it. And if we cannot come to new forms of international cooperation, new institutions, new agreements, then we will have to use our instruments to influence those countries to act according to the rules, to what we believe should be the rules. And then the trade instrument becomes the only instrument, because I honestly believe, very concretely speaking about Brazil, I think it's the only ones who can influence the government, I would assume, to change course vis-a-vis the Amazon is probably the business community that depends on being part of an international economic ecosystem where they can invest and where they can produce and trade. And if that is restricted or made more difficult because the outside world is saying we put a condition of the protection of the rainforest as condition for having trade relations, then I believe that has an it. But I would rather have a more global system where we agree on what are global public goods and also then share the responsibility for protecting those public goods. Because the counter argument of the Brazilians is, well, we need economic development. You're not helping us. You're only asking us to protect the rainforest, and that's limiting our potential. And so the counter argument would be, we will help you with your potential, but as compensation, you will protect this global good. I think this is a sort of conversation we will need to have, especially because one issue I mentioned earlier, the rapidly changing demographics globally. What are we going to say as most developed world? For us to stay healthy, you should not develop too much. That's not an argument you can use. So the direct threat to biodiversity of rapid economic expansion is clear. But if we can help that rapid economic expansion be based on sustainability goals, if we can make the United Nations SDGs sort of really into law globally, then I believe we can have human development without this posing an extra threat to global biodiversity. But for that, we need, we are in an age also of rekindled nationalism, redefining international relations purely on the basis of transactional relations. That is not helping, to put it very mildly. We need also then to reinstate international relations on the basis of well understood global interests and well understood moral imperatives. This is directly linked to our survival, but it's a lot of work to do. I think we can make advances, but here also I believe the nexus of politics, public opinion, science, activism, that nexus, and the private sector understanding full well that if they don't invest in this, they will create huge stranded assets within 10 years, then I believe we can get it right. And the moment is now. And that the scary part for me is that if we miss the next 2 and 3 years to really reset the way we want to organize our economy, I'm afraid we will let our, I've become a grandfather as well last year, we will let our children and grandchildren down, because then we will set them on a course for wars over water, and wars over arable land, and wars over breathable air. And we need to avoid that at all costs.
Vice President, thank you very much for your intervention. I believe you need to leave. You need to leave us now. Thank you very much for joining us.
I do. I would have loved to stay, but my agenda is extremely full, I'm afraid.
No, of course we understand. But thank you very much for taking the time and for sharing your views on a very, very important topic. We hope to continue this discussion sometime in the future. We'll continue the discussion with Professor Dasgupta right now for the moment. Thank you again very much, and we'll see you some other event. Thank you. Bye-bye. Professor Dasgupta, you have another 15 minutes with us. I believe you can.
Sure, absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Wonderful. There is a lot of questions that are coming from our public, and they range in all directions. Many issues that relate also to the question that Guntram asked about globalization, the distribution of the cost across humanity. How do you design that? But also, how do you design it, down at the national level? And there's a very interesting question coming from Rebecca Humphreys on this measurement of welfare. And we are in economics, we use GDP as a measure of welfare, as a measure of basically the indicator to target. Do you think that GDP is a good measure of including natural capital? And if you were to change that, what else would you put in it instead to try and to capture this idea of sustainability?
Well, GDP was invented for a completely different reason. It is to do with trying to ascertain the size of the economy, the extent to which there is economic activity. It was needed during the Depression, when there was huge unemployment, a lot of scarce capacity. Factories were lying idle. You needed some kind of a measure for that. Somehow it got transformed after the Second World War into a measure of economic development, and that was an error. It's useless for measuring long-term economic prospects as well as progress or regress of nations, because it doesn't, among other things, it doesn't include the depreciation of capital. And that's where we come back to the idea that you really ought to be tracking assets, the stocks of capital that you hold. So a householder is interested in maintaining his house, the land, the property. So that's the idea here. So the alternative, there is only one alternative, because we have shown, it can be shown analytically, that any notion of well-being, human well-being, of course, including future generations, Goddar's saying, to repeat what the Vice President had originally mentioned, that we include not just today's well-being, tomorrow's, day after, and so forth. And then you name a measure, and there is a corresponding set of social values of the assets, all the assets, human, natural, produced, such that if you estimate the wealth of the nation in terms of those prices or those social values, then its movements will mimic movements in welfare, in well-being. So it is a measure of well-being. Wealth is a measure of well-being so long as you have valued the assets correctly. Goes without saying.
Yeah.
So if I can ask you a related question here by Melanie Mora, and I will add a bit my phrasing of that question to it. So Melania is asking, is phrasing the issue as a problem of tragedy of the commons, or simply as a lack of rights and prices, masking the dimension of inequality and unmoderated consumption, in brackets, causes of historical greed, unfair governance in resource distribution, and materialism? And if I can sort of add to that question, sort of my version of that question, which would be, isn't your approach at the end of the day a fully anthropocentric approach? Because you still take as a welfare measure essentially the social welfare. It's still a human society-based welfare measure. And in geology, we are not talking about the Anthropocene, meaning humanity has taken over the climate, the biodiversity, everything. Is it still right to put the society and the humans as the evaluating and let's say value giving unit to biodiversity, or do we need to move to a different paradigm? So if you could combine those two questions.
Sure. Yeah. No, the viewpoint that I'm advocating is not anthropocentric at all, because I covered that by talking about social values, which include the nature as having an independent value to us. And you could include that. If you care about it and you want to include it, do. But when you do, then the value of the objects which are being perturbed when you take economic activity will change. So if you give additional weight to the fact that, say, the blue whales exist, all right, not just because they're a source of carbon sink or a source of meat or whatever, you add some further value because they are whales and they have an independent value, then the social value of a whale will be that much higher. And therefore, the incentive to protect them will be that much higher when you estimate wealth, because their value will be included in the wealth of the nation. Of the community.
But then the term social, just to understand, so the social value, if you say social value, it's not meant in value for society, it's meant...
No. It's social value means it's a collective, it's something, somebody has to do the valuation. The whales are not going to do that, right? So we are doing the calculation. So I'm using the word social to include all the values that you think ought to belong, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing was to do with inequality. And I should have mentioned, I didn't, but of course the review does at great length, that when I talk about national wealth, a country's wealth, I mean distribution-corrected wealth. Typically, when it comes to GDP distribution, we say, look, this is a poor part of the country, so projects will attribute a higher present value of the benefits of having the project there, because the income will go to poorer people. We give a higher weight to the income of a poor person relative to that of a rich in order to shift the investment towards the poor, okay? And that will be this case even if there are redistributional transfer payments. Same argument goes. Social welfare has gone up. Why? When somebody takes $1 away from me and gives it to a very poor person, because the argument will be that the value of that social value of that dollar to the poor person is higher than the loss that I suffer. That's the standard argument, okay? That same argument can be used on the distribution of wealth. So aside from that, that's to say, if you use now wealth-specific social prices, social values, then you can amalgamate distributional considerations very neatly into this conceptual apparatus. Now, a complaint that, well, the world has powerful institutions which are biased in favor of the poor, of the rich. Okay, that's very commonly accepted. There's nothing I can say about that other than the fact that we ought to, as citizens, fight against that. But that doesn't belittle, that doesn't remove the arguments that I've just now given, which is that in choosing our economic, any of our activities, we ought to be tracking the implications of our activities on wealth, social value of wealth. So that because everyone, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a fisherman, whether you're a woodcutter, whether you're a professor, whether you are whoever, you are managing assets.
Yeah.
We're doing that all the time. And we miss so many of the assets, which is the reason we are having this conversation here, because they don't have proper prices.
I'm very aware of our time, but if I perhaps can ask you a question that is coming from Ecke Weiss from Vienna. Our conversation today was very much not about marginal adjustments. She calls that the marginal adjustments, but it's for an all-out regime change. It's very easy to get lost in the complexity of the matter and abandon hope as a result of this complexity. So, if I were to disentangle this very knocked up knot, how would I begin? And, what is the first thing that you would do if you wanted to sort of advance this issue of diversity, change the mentality, give proper value to the asset that's called capital, natural capital? What is the one thing, if you only had one thing, what would you advise us that we should do?
Are you talking about changing mindset, or are you talking about institutional change?
Or which one is more effective? Is it
the first one is the most important, goes without saying, because otherwise the institutional change won't take place.
That's right.
The problem is to have a universal mind change. That's not going to happen. It will happen because there are activists, some citizens who are very active in this, like yourselves, like the vice president who has left us. These are the people who are going to be making the moves, and they are presumably sensitive to agitators like myself, or young children who worry and protest against climate change and so forth. So I think, all I can do is to provide an analytical foundation so that we have a grammar that everybody understands, even though what is the right thing to do, there may be disagreement, and there will inevitably be disagreement, like in any other situation. Even in the household, there are disagreements between husband and wife. This is a momentous thing. There'll be disagreement, goes without saying. But in a world in which we are really about, we are in a crash. We are in a crisis, serious crisis, no ifs and buts about it. When you have this kind of a crash, you pull together. And in a way, the COVID example is a very good one. We have realized one thing. These bad externalities, that is, things that I do which are unaccountably affecting others in a harmful way, is an environment in which you start worrying, you start questioning individual right to do anything he likes. Lockdown is a straightforward agreement of a country to say, no, you do not have the right to just walk around and do what you like, because you will be inflicting damage on other people, never mind you yourself. Okay, so something like that, and I think there were some hints at that from the vice president's remarks, that we have to get used to the idea that it'll have to be some collective agreement to limit our aspirations of doing in an unbridled way. We have to bridle ourselves. It's like tying your hands in order to make everybody better off, including yourself. That's in fact the message of the tragedy of the commons. It says you limit your actions. You agree to limit your actions, because otherwise you're collectively endangering yourself. That is the tragedy of the commons, escape from the tragedy of the commons. So in a way, the review is an escape from the tragedy of the commons writ large, and then including all the small bits and pieces through this incredible fabric of the socio-ecological world we live in.
Wonderful. So indeed, I think the picture of a lockdown for biodiversity is a very stark picture, but it's also a picture that I think resonates with really the collective action problem and also the role of institutions. And I think you rightly emphasized the enlightened individuals, the change of mindset, but I do think the institutional aspect is also extremely important, as also one of our readers, Björn Döring, is pointing out. So I'm afraid we are coming already to the end of the hour. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion for me. I think it's very encouraging to see that, you know, the analytical framework of how to think about these issues is advancing tremendously. And I think your report is doing a tremendous job in advancing that thinking. I think now the key challenge will be to implement.
The hard work lies now.
And do it, exactly. And unfortunately, humanity so far hasn't been terribly great at solving global collective action problems. So I think we all have to work very hard on trying to solve this one, because of course we are part of nature, we are part of biodiversity. We ignoring biodiversity, continuing to do it, will, even from a purely economic point of view, be extremely costly, because also pandemics are related to loss of biodiversity. And I think it's also these kind of hardcore sort of economic arguments that you know, help perhaps make collective decision making. Okay, so so I talked too long at the end, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
It was really tremendous, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you.